My name is Michael Harrison, and for 30 years I believed I was walking the narrow path to paradise. Every Saturday morning, every Tuesday and Thursday evening, every dollar I placed in the contribution box, every pamphlet I pressed into a stranger's reluctant hand, I thought each act was building my mansion in the new world. I was 68 when I finally understood that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is question your faith. I'm sitting here now in my small apartment in suburban Ohio, looking at the morning light filtering through curtains that Linda would have changed months ago. She always said our bedroom needed more color, more life. The beige walls, the simple wooden dresser, the single chair by the window where I read my daily text each morning for decades. Everything here speaks of a life lived in careful moderation, in quiet obedience to rules I once thought came directly from God's mouth. The smell of coffee fills the kitchen, the same brand I've bought for 15 years from the same grocery store on Maple Street. I measure exactly 2 tablespoons, add water to the same line on the carafe, press the same button. Routine was everything in our world. Structure, predictability, submission to the governing arrangement. These weren't just suggestions, they were the very foundation of faithful living. Linda used to sit across from me at this very table, her graying hair always neatly pinned back, her house dress pressed and modest, reading the daily text aloud while I sipped my coffee and prepared for another day of service. Today's text reminds us, Michael, she would say, her voice carrying that gentle authority that comes from complete conviction, that Jehovah sees all our efforts, even the smallest acts of faithfulness. I can still hear the rustle of the watchtower. Pages still smell the faint scent of her lavender hand lotion mixing with the morning air. Tuesday and Thursday evenings meant hurried dinners, followed by gathering our book bags, making sure we had enough literature, checking that our clothes were proper and modest. Sundays meant the whole morning devoted to the Kingdom Hall, 2 hours of meetings, then field service afterward if the circuit overseer was visiting. Our daughter Grace was 19 when I began to see the cracks in our perfect spiritual routine. She had just graduated from high school and was making plans, bright-eyed plans about serving at Bethel, about dedicating her life to the organization's work. "Dad," she would say, organizing her Pioneer school materials on the kitchen table, "isn't it amazing how Jehovah provides exactly what we need when we put kingdom interests first?" I was proud of her dedication. Grace had been raised in the truth, baptized at 16, regular in service, always prepared for the meetings. She could recite scripture with the fluency of someone who had never known any other way of thinking. When she spoke about her future, her words carried the same confident rhythm of every young witness I had ever known, as if she was reading from a script we had all memorized. But something in her certainty began to disturb me, though I couldn't name it then. It was the way she repeated phrases exactly as we had heard them from the platform, the way her expressions never seemed to vary from the approved vocabulary we all used. Putting kingdom interests first, showing loyalty to Jehovah's organization, trusting in the faithful slave class. These phrases rolled off her tongue with practiced ease. But I began to wonder when she had stopped thinking about what they actually meant. I had served as an elder for 12 years by then, appointed in my early 50s after demonstrating what the circuit overseer called spiritual maturity and sound judgment. I conducted judicial committees, counseled struggling families, gave talks from the platform about faithfulness and endurance. My voice carried weight in our congregation. When I spoke, people listened with the kind of respectful attention reserved for those who represent God's authority. The irony wasn't lost on me, even then. Here I was, questioning my daughter's automatic responses when my own life had become a series of automatic responses to the organization's gentle guidance. Every decision, where to work, how to spend our money, what books to read, which movies were appropriate, how to discipline our child, had been filtered through the Watchtower's counsel. We thought it was freedom, this clear guidance from God's visible organization. We thought it was love. Linda's illness came gradually, the way these things often do. First the persistent headaches, then the fatigue that wouldn't improve, no matter how much she rested. The medical bills began accumulating even as the elders reminded us that true healing comes through prayer and faithfulness to Jehovah. Sister Harrison, Brother Stevens told us during a shepherding visit, remember that our struggles in this system of things are temporary. Keep your eyes focused on the new world, where there will be no more pain or suffering. But the pain was here. Now, in our modest living room with its carefully dusted shelves, lined with bound volumes of Watchtower literature, the suffering was immediate, pressing against our faith like water against a dam. And slowly, I began to realize that our Kingdom Hall family's support felt more like management than comfort, more like keeping us in line than truly caring for. Our needs, that's where this story really begins, not with dramatic rebellion or sudden enlightenment, but with small, uncomfortable questions that began to grow in the quiet spaces between prayers. The man I had become at 68 was shaped by decades of careful discipline and unquestioning loyalty. Michael Harrison, born in 1955 to a Methodist family in rural Pennsylvania, had found his way to the Kingdom Hall in his early 20s through a chance encounter with two earnest young men who knocked on my apartment door one rainy Thursday evening. I was working third shift at a local factory then, struggling with questions about purpose and meaning that my childhood faith couldn't seem to answer. When I opened that door and saw those two clean-cut young men with their leather book bags and confident smiles, something in their certainty appealed to the part of me that craved structure. "Good evening, sir," the taller one said, his voice carrying that particular blend of politeness and conviction I would later learn to recognize in all dedicated witnesses. "We're visiting your neighbors tonight to share some encouraging news from the Bible. Do you ever wonder why there's so much suffering in the world despite all our technological advances?" It was 1977, and I was 22 years old, working nights and sleeping through most of my days, feeling disconnected from any sense of greater purpose. The question hung in the air of my sparse apartment, like an invitation I hadn't known I was waiting for. Within 6 months, I was attending meetings regularly. Within a year, I was baptized. Within 5 years, I had married Linda Walsh, a gentle woman from our congregation who shared my newfound dedication to what we called the truth. Linda came from a family of third-generation witnesses. Her father had been an elder, her mother a pioneer, and Linda herself had been raised with the kind of unwavering certainty that I found both comforting and intimidating. She never seemed to struggle with doubt the way I occasionally did in those early years, when I would voice small questions about certain teachings or organizational policies. Linda would smile that patient smile of hers and remind me that Jehovah's wisdom was higher than human wisdom. "Michael," she would say, folding laundry on our bed while I sat reading the latest Watchtower, "remember that our understanding gets brighter as we get closer to the end. The faithful slave class helps us understand things we couldn't understand on our own." Her voice carried no uncertainty, no hidden questions. She believed with the pure faith of someone who had never known any other way of thinking. By the early 1980s, we had settled into the rhythm that would define our next 30 years. I worked as a supervisor at a mid-sized manufacturing company, a position that provided steady income, without requiring the kind of overtime that would interfere with meeting attendance or field service. Linda worked part-time as a secretary for a local insurance agency, carefully choosing employers who respected her need for time off for assemblies and conventions. Our house on Elm Street was a modest 2-story colonial with a small front yard, where Linda planted flowers each spring, marigolds and petunias in careful rows that bloomed reliably through the summer months. The living room held our most prized possessions, a complete set of watchtower-bound volumes dating back to 1950, carefully arranged on built-in shelves that I had installed myself. Above them hung a framed picture of Jesus surrounded by children, of all races, his arms outstretched in welcome, the kind of artwork that could be found in virtually every witness home across the country. Grace was born in 1984, during what we then believed were the final years before Armageddon. The organization had recently published new understanding about the generation that would see the end, and we genuinely believed we were raising our daughter in the last days of this old system of things. Every decision we made about her upbringing was filtered through this expectation of imminent change. She grew up attending meetings twice weekly, sitting between Linda and me in the same row we occupied for 15 years, third row from the front, right side of the Kingdom Hall. Grace learned to color quietly during the public talks, to raise her hand during the Watchtower study, to recite the names of Bible books before she could properly around the organization's schedule. Tuesday night book study, Thursday evening theocratic ministry school, Sunday morning public meeting and Watchtower study, Saturday morning field service. I was appointed as a ministerial servant in 1988 when Grace was 4 years old. The appointment came after years of regular meeting attendance, consistent field service reports, and careful attention to my family's spiritual example. Brother Morrison, the presiding overseer, called me into the back room after a Thursday evening meeting to share the news. "Brother Harrison," he said, his weathered hands folded on the small table between us, "the body of elders has been observing your spiritual progress, and we're pleased to recommend you for appointment as a ministerial servant. You've shown the kind of steady growth and family leadership that qualifies you to take on additional responsibilities in the congregation." The announcement was made the following Sunday, and I felt a surge of validation that I hadn't expected. Linda squeezed my hand during the announcement, and I could see tears of pride in her eyes. Grace, now old enough to understand what was happening, beamed up at me from her seat. This was recognition, proof that our careful adherence to the organization's guidance was bearing fruit. 5 years later, I was appointed as an elder. The ceremony was simple but profound, a private meeting with the circuit overseer during his semi-annual visit, where he laid his hands on my shoulders and offered a prayer, asking for God's blessing on my new responsibilities. I was 48 years old, successful in my secular work, respected in my congregation, the father of a dedicated daughter who was already showing signs of spiritual maturity beyond her years. But it was precisely this success, this validation from the organization I had come to see as God's visible representative on earth, that would make the question so much harder when they finally came. The higher you climb in any system, the more invested you become in believing that system is righteous. The more responsibility you're given, the more reluctant you become to acknowledge that the foundation might be flawed. Brother Stevens, the presiding overseer during my early years as an elder, was a man I deeply respected. He had been serving faithfully for over 20 years, had pioneered in foreign countries during his youth, and spoke with the authority of someone who had never publicly doubted the organization's teachings. During elders' meetings, he would guide our discussions with patient wisdom, always bringing us back to the Watchtower's published guidance when our human reasoning threatened to lead us astray. "Brothers," he would say when one of us questioned a particular organizational policy, "we need to remember that we're not wise enough to make these decisions on our own. The faithful and discreet slave class has been appointed by Christ himself to provide spiritual food at the proper time. Our job is to trust their guidance, even when we don't fully understand the reasoning." Those words became a refrain in our elders' meetings, a gentle correction whenever anyone expressed doubt or suggested alternative approaches to the challenges our congregation faced. Trust the organization. Follow the guidance. Don't lean on your own understanding. These weren't just suggestions. They were the fundamental principles that held our entire worldview together, and for years, decades, they worked. The framework provided answers to every question, comfort in every crisis, direction for every decision. Until Linda got sick, and the framework began to crack under the weight of real suffering that defied easy explanations. Words in this block. 1 Adulbazu 294. I need to expand this section to meet the target of 2,000 plus to 3% words, 1,940, 2,060. Let me continue. The progression from ministerial servant to elder had been gradual but steady, marked by increasing involvement in the administrative and judicial work of our congregation. As an elder, I found myself spending Tuesday evenings in backroom meetings where we discussed the spiritual welfare of our flock, reviewed field service reports, and made decisions about who was qualified for privileges and who needed counsel or discipline. These meetings followed a predictable pattern. Brother Stevens would open with prayer, asking for God's Spirit to guide our decisions. We would review correspondence from the branch office, discuss upcoming circuit assembly arrangements, and address any congregational issues that required attention. The conversations were always conducted in hushed, serious tones, with frequent references to our responsibility to protect the spiritual purity of the congregation. During this period, I handled my first judicial committee, a case involving a young man who had been accused of inappropriate conduct with his girlfriend. The process was carefully outlined in the Elder's Manual. Gather evidence, interview witnesses, determine if wrongdoing had occurred, and decide on appropriate discipline. We met in the small conference room behind the main hall, with its single table, 4 chairs, and framed picture of Jesus that seemed to watch over our deliberations. The young man, barely 20 years old, sat across from us with tears in his eyes as we questioned him about intimate details of his relationship. "Brother Taylor," I heard myself saying in the same measured tone I had learned from observing other judicial hearings, "you need to understand that sexual immorality is a serious matter in God's eyes. We're here to help you restore your relationship with Jehovah, but that requires complete honesty about what happened. Looking back, I can see how the process was designed to maintain control rather than provide genuine help." The young man was disfellowshipped, cut off from all contact with family and friends in the congregation, sentenced to months of isolation before he could even begin the process of reinstatement. At the time, I believed we were upholding God's standards. Now I wonder how many lives we damaged in the name of spiritual purity. My secular work provided a helpful contrast to the intensity of congregational responsibilities. The manufacturing plant where I supervised quality control operated on principles of efficiency and measurable results. Problems were solved through analysis and adjustment, not through prayer and submission to authority. Employees were valued for their skills and productivity, not for their adherence to a complex system of behavioral rules. I found myself increasingly compartmentalizing my 2 worlds, the practical, problem-solving environment of my workplace and the faith-based, authority-driven culture of the Kingdom Hall. At work, I could voice disagreement with management decisions, suggest improvements to processes, and be rewarded for innovative thinking. At the Kingdom Hall, these same qualities were subtly discouraged as signs of pride or lack of humility. Linda's part-time work at the insurance agency provided her with similar contrasts, though she seemed less affected by them than I was. She worked for Mr. Patterson, an elderly man who appreciated her reliability and attention to detail, but never asked about her weekend activities or evening commitments. Her co-workers knew she was religious, but respected her boundaries when she declined invitations to office parties or holiday celebrations. I told them I don't participate in Christmas parties for religious reasons, Linda would report after work, hanging her coat in our front closet with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. They're very understanding. Mr. Patterson even said he admires people who stick to their principles. This kind of respectful accommodation from worldly people sometimes puzzled me. The organization taught that people outside the truth were generally hostile to our beliefs, yet most of the non-witness people we encountered in our daily lives seemed remarkably tolerant and even supportive of our choices. It was a small inconsistency, but one that lodged in my memory alongside other small questions that would eventually grow larger. Grace's teenage years coincided with what the organization called the best life ever, a period of enthusiasm and growth that saw our congregation's membership increase from 60 to nearly 90 publishers. New families were joining regularly, many of them attracted by our reputation for strong family values and clear moral guidance in an increasingly confusing world. Grace thrived in this environment. She was appointed as a regular pioneer at 18, committing to spend 90 hours per month in field service while maintaining excellent grades in her senior year of high school. Her comments during the Watchtower study were always well-prepared and scripturally sound, delivered with the confident poise of someone who had never seriously questioned what she was saying. "Dad," she told me one evening as we sat in our living room reviewing the next day's Watchtower lesson, "I love how clear everything is in God's organization. I have friends at school who are always stressed about making decisions, but we have guidance for everything. It makes life so much easier." Her words filled me with pride, and I now realize a growing unease that I couldn't quite name. The certainty she expressed was beautiful in its simplicity, but it reminded me increasingly of my own automatic responses to difficult questions. When had we stopped thinking and started simply repeating approved answers? When had faith become indistinguishable from compliance? The financial pressures of maintaining our lifestyle while supporting the organization's activities had been manageable during my peak earning years, but they required careful budgeting and occasional to the worldwide work, supported the Kingdom Hall Building Fund, and covered the costs of attending 3-day circuit assemblies and week-long district conventions twice yearly. Linda kept meticulous records of our contributions in a small notebook that she stored in her desk drawer. "We want to make sure we're giving what we can," she would say, calculating percentages and comparing our donations to previous years. Jehovah loves a cheerful giver, and we've been blessed with more than we need. These financial commitments, added to the time requirements of meeting attendance and field service, created a lifestyle that revolved entirely around organizational activities. We had few non-witness friends, limited involvement in community activities, and little time for hobbies or interests that weren't directly connected to our spiritual responsibilities. Yet this total immersion in the organization's culture felt like blessing rather than burden for most of our adult lives. We were surrounded by people who shared our values, supported our choices, and reinforced our belief that we had found the narrow road to life. The sense of belonging, of being part of something larger and more meaningful than ourselves, provided a satisfaction that I had never experienced before, becoming one of Jehovah's Witnesses. It was only when Linda became ill, when our carefully constructed world began to crack under the pressure of genuine crisis, that I started to see the framework more clearly, not as divine guidance, but as human control disguised in spiritual language. Linda's headaches began. In the spring of 2019, just subtle aches that she mentioned casually while preparing breakfast on Saturday mornings before field service. "I think I need new glasses," she would say, rubbing her temples as she poured orange juice into our matching glass tumblers. These headaches are becoming more frequent. I suggested she see Dr. Martinez, our family physician for the past 15 years, but Linda was reluctant to miss meetings or field service for medical appointments. The culture of our congregation, like most witness communities, subtly discouraged too much focus on physical ailments. Not explicitly, but through gentle reminders about trusting in Jehovah's care and maintaining spiritual priorities. Brother Stevens had given several talks over the years about not being overly concerned with health issues that might distract us from kingdom interests. "We know this system is winding down," he would say from the platform, his voice carrying that familiar tone of patient instruction. "Our focus should be on spiritual health, which will matter for eternity." So Linda endured the headaches through summer, treating them with over-the-counter medications and increasing her personal study time, believing that drawing closer to Jehovah would help her cope with whatever she was experiencing. I watched her press her fingers against her forehead during meetings, trying to concentrate on the speaker's words despite the obvious discomfort. When I suggested she should prioritize her health, she would smile with gentle correction. "Michael," she would say, settling beside me on our floral-patterned sofa after evening meetings, "remember what we learned about Job? His suffering was a test of his faithfulness. Maybe Jehovah is allowing this to strengthen my endurance." Her faith in these explanations was absolute, unshakable, rooted in decades of teaching that portrayed suffering as either divine testing or consequences of imperfection in Satan's world. By October, the headaches had intensified into episodes that would leave Linda nauseated and unable to function normally. She missed her first meeting in 20 years, staying home on a Thursday evening while I attended the ministry school alone. I remember sitting in our usual row, the empty space beside me feeling like an accusation. Several brothers and sisters approached me afterward to express concern. "Brother Harrison," Sister Martinez whispered, as we gathered our book bags in the Kingdom Hall's modest foyer, "is everything all right with Linda? We noticed she wasn't here tonight." The question carried undertones I was beginning to recognize, concern mixed with subtle evaluation of our spiritual strength. In our organization, missing meetings required explanation, and illness wasn't always considered sufficient reason. "She's dealing with some persistent headaches," I explained, maintaining the composed demeanor expected of an elder's family. "We're hoping they'll improve soon," but privately I was growing worried about symptoms that seemed to be worsening despite Linda's faithful endurance and increased prayer. Dr. Martinez referred us to a neurologist after basic tests revealed nothing conclusive. The appointments required Linda to miss additional meetings and field service, which created a spiral of guilt that I could see wearing her down emotionally. "I feel like I'm failing Jehovah," she confided one evening as we sat in our kitchen, the familiar surroundings somehow feeling less secure than they had for 30 years. "Maybe," she continued, her voice smaller than usual, "maybe I'm not putting enough trust in spiritual healing. Remember how the elders taught us that sometimes Jehovah allows illness to test our faith? Maybe I should be focusing more on prayer and less on medical treatments." The way she voiced this concern revealed how deeply our organizational training had shaped her thinking about health and divine intervention. The neurologist, Dr. Chen, was a kind woman about Grace's age, who explained test procedures with careful patience. But her secular approach to Linda's symptoms felt somehow foreign after decades of attributing physical problems to spiritual causes. When Dr. Chen suggested an MRI to rule out serious conditions, Linda hesitated before agreeing. "I just want to make sure," Linda told me as we drove home from that appointment, "that we're not showing lack of faith by pursuing too much medical intervention. Remember how Brother Stevens always says that our trust should be in Jehovah's healing power, not in worldly medicine? These weren't unusual concerns in our community, where medical treatment was permitted but often viewed with subtle suspicion. The test results came back on a Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Chen called while Linda was resting after another severe headache episode, and I took the call in our quiet kitchen, surrounded by the familiar domesticity of our shared life. Her words seemed to come from very far away. Brain tumor, inoperable, aggressive type, 6 months to 2 years, depending on treatment options. I sat at our kitchen table, looking out at Linda's carefully tended garden where late roses still bloomed. Despite the approaching winter, trying to process information that didn't fit into any framework our faith had prepared us to handle. This wasn't persecution for righteousness' sake. This wasn't testing like Job experienced. This was simply medical reality, indifferent to our decades of faithful service and unwavering loyalty to Jehovah's organization. When I told Linda about the diagnosis, her first response wasn't fear or anger, but concern about maintaining spiritual priorities. "We need to tell the elders," she said, sitting on our bed surrounded by get-well cards from congregation members who had been praying for her recovery. "They'll want to arrange for increased shepherding visits to help us maintain our spiritual strength during this trial." The elders' response was predictably supportive within the organization's framework. Brother Stevens and Brother Morrison arranged to visit us the following Thursday evening, bringing their Bibles and a folder of encouraging material from recent Watchtower publications about facing serious illness with faith. They sat in our living room, in the same chairs where we had hosted countless book studies and shepherding visits over the years, offering comfort through familiar scriptural promises. "Brother and Sister Harrison," Brother Stevens said, his weathered hands folded over his open Bible, "we want you to know that the congregation is praying for you during this difficult time. Remember that Jehovah sees your faithfulness, and he won't allow you to be tested beyond what you can bear." His words carried the weight of sincere conviction, but they felt increasingly inadequate against the stark reality of Linda's diagnosis. "Brother," Morrison added practical counsel about maintaining meeting attendance when possible and keeping up with personal study despite the challenging circumstances. "Sometimes," he said, "Jehovah allows trials like this to refine our faith and demonstrate our loyalty to him and his organization. We've seen many brothers and sisters grow stronger spiritually through health challenges." Their visit lasted 2 hours, filled with scriptural readings about resurrection, hope, and faithful endurance. They offered to arrange for recorded talks when Linda couldn't attend meetings, and suggested she might enjoy pioneering from home by making telephone witnessing calls when she felt strong enough. The gesture was meant kindly, but it revealed the organization's tendency to interpret every situation through the lens of field service and meeting attendance. After they left, Linda and I sat together in our living room, surrounded by the religious literature and family photographs that had defined our shared life for 30 years. "I'm grateful for their concern," Linda said, but her voice carried a weariness that hadn't been there before the diagnosis. "But sometimes I wonder if they really understand what we're facing." It was the first time I had heard Linda express any doubt about the organization's approach to personal problems, and her words stayed with me through the sleepless nights, which involved radiation therapy and medications that left her exhausted and nauseated. I began to notice patterns in how our congregation responded to serious illness that troubled me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The initial outpouring of support was genuine and generous. Sisters brought meals, brothers offered to handle yard work, and many friends called regularly to check on Linda's condition. But as weeks turned into months, and Linda's attendance at meetings became increasingly sporadic, the attention began to shift toward gentle encouragement to maintain spiritual priorities despite physical limitations. Sister Harrison, one of the pioneer sisters, mentioned during a brief visit, "I hope you're able to keep up with the magazines even when you can't make it to meetings. There's so much spiritual food being provided right now, and we don't want you to fall behind in your understanding of present truth." The comment was offered with genuine concern, but it reflected the organization's emphasis on compliance over compassion. Meanwhile, Grace's response to her mother's illness revealed how thoroughly she had internalized the organization's teachings about suffering and divine purpose. Now 25 and serving as a regular pioneer, Grace approached Linda's diagnosis as an opportunity to demonstrate faith under trial. "Mom," she would say during her weekly visits, "remember that this is temporary. Soon we'll all be together in the new world where there won't be any sickness or pain." Her words echoed the comfort we had been taught to offer in times of crisis, but they began to sound hollow against the immediate reality of Linda's daily struggle with pain and fear. I found myself wanting more substantial support than scriptural platitudes, more practical help than reminders about future paradise. These weren't rebellious thoughts exactly, but they represented a growing disconnect between our taught responses and my emotional needs. The medical bills, even with insurance coverage, created financial pressure that complicated our situation further. Treatment costs, prescription medications, and time off work to care for Linda strained our budget in ways we hadn't anticipated. When I mentioned these concerns to Brother Stevens during a routine shepherding visit, his response focused on trusting Jehovah's provision rather than addressing practical solutions. "Brother Harrison," he said, "remember how Jesus taught about not being anxious over necessities like food and clothing. Jehovah knows what we need, and he'll provide what's necessary, as long as we keep seeking his kingdom first." His counsel was sincere, but it didn't help with the mounting medical expenses that required immediate attention. During one of our elders' meetings around this time, Brother Morrison mentioned that several families in the congregation were struggling financially due to various circumstances. "We need to be careful," he said, "not to encourage excessive focus on material concerns. The organization's literature reminds us that financial difficulties often serve to strengthen our dependence on Jehovah rather than on our own efforts." This perspective, which had once seemed spiritually mature to me, began to feel inadequate when applied to actual human suffering. The organization's tendency to spiritualize every problem, to find divine purpose in every difficulty, started to seem less like wisdom and more like avoidance of genuine compassion and practical support. As Linda's condition gradually worsened, despite treatment, I began to experience doubt that felt different from the minor questions I had occasionally entertained over the years. These weren't intellectual disagreements with specific teachings, but emotional disconnection from the organization's approach to real human need. The framework that had provided security and meaning for 30 years seemed increasingly fragile when tested against actual crisis. One evening in late spring, as I sat beside Linda's bed, reading aloud from the watchtower while she drifted in and out of sleep, I realized that I was going through the motions of faith without feeling the conviction that had once sustained me. The words on the page felt like someone else's thoughts. The promised comfort seemed directed at someone else's problems, and the certainty that had defined my adult life was beginning to crack under the weight of questions I wasn't supposed to ask. Linda passed away on a quiet Thursday morning in June 2020, just over a year after her diagnosis. She died at home, surrounded by family and a few close friends from the congregation, her hand in mine as I whispered the 23rd Psalm in her ear. Her funeral service, held at the Kingdom Hall where we had worshipped together for 2 decades, was beautiful in its simplicity and devastating in its adherence to organizational guidelines about memorial talks. The speaker, A visiting elder from a nearby congregation delivered a presentation that mentioned Linda's name perhaps 6 times during a 30-minute talk that was primarily focused on resurrection hope and organizational teachings about death, her life, her personality, her individual struggles, and joys were barely acknowledged in favor of generic comfort from Watchtower publications. I sat in the front row, listening to a stranger reduce my wife's existence to a series of doctrinal points, and felt something fundamental shift inside my understanding of what we called loving provision from God's organization. After the funeral, as congregation members offered their condolences with the same scripted phrases I had heard at every witness memorial service, I began to understand that my journey toward questioning everything I had believed was just beginning. The comfort they offered felt hollow. Their certainty about Linda's future seemed presumptuous, and their gentle pressure to maintain my spiritual routine felt increasingly disconnected from my actual emotional needs. Words in this block. 2 Fan 34. I need to reduce this section to meet the target of 3,600 plus 3% words. 3,492, 3,708. Let me continue with the remaining portion. Grace's response to her mother's death crystallized many of the concerns that had been growing in my mind during Linda's illness. At 25, she had been shaped entirely by the organization's teachings about loss and grief, and her efforts to comfort me followed the prescribed patterns we had both learned over decades of Kingdom Hall attendance. "Dad," she said as we cleaned out Linda's personal belongings a week after the funeral, "I know this is difficult, but remember that Mom's death wasn't really death. She's just sleeping until the resurrection. In just a few years, when Armageddon comes, we'll see her again exactly as she was." Grace's words carried absolute conviction, the certainty of someone who had never seriously questioned the framework that shaped her understanding of life and death. But her confidence began to highlight the hollowness I was feeling in my own faith. The resurrection hope that had once provided genuine comfort now seemed like a distant promise that didn't address the immediate reality of missing Linda's presence every morning when I made coffee for one person instead of 2. The organizational emphasis on viewing death as temporary sleep felt dismissive of the real grief that was consuming me. As summer progressed into fall, I found myself increasingly isolated within our congregation's social structure. The initial support following Linda's death gradually diminished as life returned to normal for everyone except me. Brothers and sisters would ask how I was doing, but their questions seemed perfunctory, and my honest answers about struggling with doubt and sadness appeared to make people uncomfortable. "Brother Harrison," Sister Martinez mentioned one Sunday after the Watchtower study, "we've missed seeing you at the Tuesday evening book study. Are you managing to keep up with your personal study during this difficult time?" Her concern was genuine, but the underlying message was clear. Spiritual activities were expected to continue, regardless of personal circumstances. The pressure to maintain normal levels of meeting attendance and field service participation while grieving felt increasingly burdensome. When I missed a Thursday evening meeting because I simply couldn't face sitting through another presentation about faithful endurance, Brother Stevens called to check on my spiritual welfare. "Michael," he said during our phone conversation, "I understand you're going through a difficult adjustment, but isolation isn't the answer. The congregation is your spiritual family, and we need each other's encouragement, especially during trials like this." His words carried the weight of organizational authority, but they felt disconnected from my actual emotional state. During this period, I began to pay closer attention to aspects of our congregation's culture that I had previously accepted without question. The emphasis on maintaining appearances, The subtle pressure to conform to expected responses, the tendency to spiritualize every problem rather than address practical and emotional needs. These patterns became more apparent as I struggled with genuine crisis that didn't fit neatly into the organization's framework. One evening in November, while organizing Linda's desk drawers, I discovered her private notebook where she had recorded not only our financial contributions to the organization, but also her personal thoughts during the months of her illness. Reading her handwritten reflections revealed doubts and fears that she had never shared with me or anyone else in our congregation. Sometimes I wonder, one entry read, "If Jehovah really sees individual suffering the way the organization this illness is a test of faith, but it feels more like random misfortune than divine purpose." I don't want to express these thoughts to Michael or the elders because I know they would be concerned about my spiritual state, but I can't help questioning whether our explanations for suffering are adequate. Her words, written in the careful handwriting I had known for 30 years, revealed that even Linda, whose faith had always seemed unshakable, had privately struggled with the same questions that were now consuming me. The discovery was both heartbreaking and validating. Heartbreaking because I realized how alone she had felt with her doubts, and validating because it confirmed that my growing skepticism wasn't simply a result of grief or spiritual weakness. Around this same time, I encountered David Morrison, a former elder from a neighboring congregation who had left the organization several years earlier. Our paths crossed at a local coffee shop where I had begun spending Saturday mornings instead of participating in field service, and our conversation opened my eyes to perspectives I had never seriously considered. "Michael," David said as we sat at a small table near the window, watching ordinary people go about their Saturday morning routines, "I remember you from circuit assemblies. You were always one of the elders who seemed genuinely dedicated to helping people. That's probably why you're struggling now, because you're starting to see the difference between the organization's claims about love and its actual treatment of human need." He shared his own story of gradual disillusionment, beginning with concerns about judicial committees and ending with research into the organization's financial practices and historical claims. "The hardest part," he explained, "wasn't losing faith in specific teachings. It was realizing that the entire structure was designed to maintain control rather than provide genuine spiritual guidance." Our conversation lasted 3 hours, covering topics I had never discussed openly with anyone: the organization's handling of abuse allegations, the psychological pressure of constant judgment and evaluation, the financial opacity of leadership decisions, and the isolation experienced by members who dared to question official teachings. David's perspective challenged every assumption I had held about the organization's divine appointment and benevolent intentions. As winter approached, bringing the first anniversary of Linda's initial symptoms, I found myself conducting careful research into areas of organizational history and practice that I had never examined critically. The internet provided access to documents and testimonies that revealed patterns of behavior inconsistent with the organization's claims about itself. Financial records showed vast real estate holdings and investment portfolios that seemed inconsistent with the modest lifestyle demanded of ordinary members. Legal documents revealed systematic efforts to silence abuse victims and protect institutional reputation rather than safeguard vulnerable individuals. Historical research exposed repeated doctrinal changes presented as new light rather than acknowledgement of previous errors. Each discovery felt like another crack in the foundation of everything I had built my adult life upon. The organization I had served faithfully for 30 years trusted completely for guidance in every aspect of life and promoted enthusiastically to others as God's sole channel of communication. appeared to be a human institution primarily concerned with its own preservation and growth. The most painful realization was understanding how thoroughly the system had trained us to suppress critical thinking in favor of obedient acceptance. Questions were discouraged as signs of pride or lack of faith. Alternative perspectives were dismissed as apostate influences. Independent research was condemned as dangerous reliance on human wisdom rather than divine guidance through the organization's publications. As 2021 began, I faced a choice that would determine the rest of my life. Continue participating in a system I no longer believed in, or risk losing everything and everyone I had known for 3 decades by acknowledging my loss of faith in the organization's claims about itself. The moment of decision came on a cold February morning in 2021, 8 months after Linda's death. I was sitting at our kitchen table, the same spot where she used to read the daily text aloud while I prepared for another day of faithful service. The house felt hollow without her presence, but that morning it felt different, charged with possibility rather than emptiness. In front of me lay documents I had printed from my research. Financial statements showing the organization's vast wealth while local congregations struggled with basic expenses, court records revealing systematic cover-ups of abuse cases, and testimonies from former members whose experiences mirrored my own growing discomfort with the system I had served for 30 years. My phone rang at exactly 8:30 a.m., Brother Stevens calling to discuss my decreasing meeting attendance and field service participation. His voice carried the familiar mixture of concern and authority I had known since my early years as an elder. "Michael," he said, "the other elders and I have been concerned about your spiritual welfare since Linda's death. We understand grief can affect our service to Jehovah, but it's been 8 months now. We think it might be beneficial for you to meet with us this evening to discuss how we can help you regain your spiritual strength." The invitation wasn't really an invitation. It was a summons couched in language of loving concern. I had participated in dozens of similar meetings over the years, sitting on the other side of the table as we gently pressured struggling members to conform to organizational expectations. Now I was the target of that well-intentioned coercion. "Brother Stevens," I heard myself say, my voice steadier than I expected, "I appreciate your concern, but I don't think a meeting with the elders is what I need right now. I've been doing some serious thinking about my beliefs, and I have questions about the organization that I need to resolve before I can continue participating in congregation activities." The silence on the other end lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When Brother Stevens spoke again, his tone had shifted from pastoral concern to administrative caution. "Michael, that's exactly why you need to meet with us. When we're grieving or going through trials, we can become vulnerable to doubts and wrong thinking. The organization provides exactly the guidance you need during difficult times like this. Isolating yourself and relying on independent research or outside influences will only lead you further from the truth." His response confirmed everything I had been learning about the organization's approach to dissent. Questions weren't addressed with evidence or reasoning. They were dismissed as symptoms of spiritual weakness requiring organizational correction. Doubt wasn't treated as a natural human response to inconsistent information. It was pathologized as dangerous thinking requiring immediate intervention. "I understand your concern," I replied, looking out at Linda's garden where early spring flowers were beginning to emerge despite the February cold, but I need to be honest with you. I've discovered information about the organization's financial practices and handling of abuse cases that I can't reconcile with our teachings about being God's clean organization. I need time to process these discoveries before I can determine how to move forward. Another pause, shorter this time, followed by words that would change everything between us. "Brother Harrison," Brother Stevens said, his voice now carrying unmistakable firmness, "if you've been researching critical information about God's organization from outside sources, you're already on a dangerous path. That kind of material comes from apostates who are motivated by Satan to destroy faith. We strongly urge you to stop this research immediately and focus on what Jehovah provides through his faithful organization." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but those words crystallized the choice I was facing. I could submit to organizational authority by abandoning my questions and returning to compliant participation, or I could pursue truth wherever it led, knowing that honest inquiry was characterized as spiritual rebellion. That evening, instead of attending the elders' meeting Brother Stevens had arranged, I sat in Linda's favorite chair and wrote a letter that I had been composing in my mind for weeks. The words came easily, as if they had been waiting for permission to emerge, to the body of elders, Oakwood Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. After 30 years of faithful service as a publisher, ministerial servant, and elder, I must inform you that I can no longer in good conscience participate in the activities of this organization. This decision comes not from bitterness or moral failure, but from careful examination of information that contradicts fundamental claims about the organization's role as God's sole channel of communication. I have discovered financial practices that appear inconsistent with the modest lifestyle demanded of members, institutional responses to abuse allegations that prioritize organizational reputation over victim welfare, and historical patterns of doctrinal changes that suggest human fallibility rather than divine guidance. These discoveries, combined with my observations of how the organization responds to honest questions and sincere doubt, have convinced me that this is a human institution like any other, deserving neither unquestioning loyalty nor exclusive meetings or field service. I do not wish to be contacted by elders seeking to restore me to organizational fellowship. This decision is final and based on conscientious conviction rather than emotional reaction to personal loss. I wish you and the congregation well, but I must follow my conscience, even when it leads away from everything I have known for most of my adult life. Respectfully, Michael Harrison. Writing those words felt like stepping off a cliff, but also like breathing freely for the first time in months. I sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it on the kitchen counter where I would see it first thing in the morning, knowing that delivering it would end my life as Michael Harrison, respected elder, and begin my existence as Michael Harrison, apostate. The next morning I drove to the Kingdom Hall and slid the envelope through the mail slot in the front door. Brother Stevens called within hours, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Michael, we received your letter. You can't make this kind of decision while you're clearly not thinking clearly. We're arranging for the circuit overseer to meet with you next week. He has experience helping brothers who've been influenced by apostate thinking, and he can provide the spiritual assistance you need to overcome these doubts." "Brother Stevens," I interrupted, surprised by my own calmness. "I appreciate your concern, but my decision is final. I've spent months carefully considering this choice, and it's based on evidence and conviction, not emotional instability. I won't be meeting with the circuit overseer or anyone else from the organization. Then you're choosing to abandon Jehovah and his people," he replied, his voice carrying disappointment and finality. "You know what this means for your relationship with Grace and everyone else who loves you. Are you really willing to throw away eternal life and destroy your family for these doubts that Satan has planted in your mind?" His words struck at the heart of what made leaving so difficult, not the loss of religious beliefs, which had already dissolved through research and reflection, but the loss of human relationships that had defined my social world for 30 years. Grace, our congregation friends, even casual acquaintances from circuit assemblies and conventions, all of these connections would be severed by organizational policy requiring complete shunning of former members. "I'm not abandoning God," I replied, my voice breaking slightly as I realized this might be my last conversation with anyone from the organization I had served for most of my adult life. I'm abandoning a human institution that has convinced its members it speaks for God. There's a difference, even if you can't see it right now. Brother Stevens ended the call without saying goodbye. Within a week, the Judicial Committee announcement was made at the Thursday evening meeting I didn't attend. Michael Harrison is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. 28 words that erased 30 years of service and marked me as spiritually dead to everyone who had been part of my religious family. The finality of that announcement, reported to me by a neighbor who still attended meetings, felt both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it confirmed the loss of every meaningful relationship I had maintained for 3 decades. Liberating because it freed me from the exhausting effort of pretending to believe in something that no longer made sense to my mind or conscience. That night, I sat in Linda's chair and cried, not from regret about my decision, but from grief about the cost of choosing truth over belonging. I had gained intellectual honesty and personal integrity, but lost my daughter, my community, and the comfortable certainty that had guided my adult life. At 66 years old, I was starting over with nothing but my convictions and the hope. That authenticity was worth the price I had paid for it. Words in this block 1349. I need to reduce this section to meet the target of 1200 plus 3% words, 164, 1236. Let me revise to fit the required range. The moment of decision came on a cold February morning in 2021, 8 months after Linda's death. I was sitting at our kitchen table, the same spot where she used to read the daily text aloud while I prepared for another day of faithful service. In front of me lay documents from my research, financial statements showing the organization's vast wealth, court records revealing cover-ups of abuse cases, and testimonies from former members whose experiences mirrored my own growing discomfort. My phone rang at exactly 8:30 a.m., Brother Stevens calling to discuss my decreasing meeting attendance. His voice carried the familiar mixture of concern and authority I had known since my early years as an elder. "Michael," he said, "the other elders and I have been concerned about your spiritual welfare since Linda's death. We think it might be beneficial for you to meet with us this evening to discuss how we can help you regain your spiritual strength." The invitation wasn't really an invitation. It was a summons couched in language of loving concern. I had participated in dozens of similar meetings over the years, sitting on the other side of the table as we gently pressured struggling members to conform to organizational expectations. "Brother Stevens," I heard myself say, my voice steadier than I expected, "I appreciate your concern, but I don't think a meeting with the elders is what I need right now. I've been doing some serious thinking about my beliefs, and I have questions about the organization that I need to resolve before I can continue participating." The silence lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When Brother Stevens spoke again, his tone had shifted from pastoral concern to administrative caution. "Michael, that's exactly why you need to meet with us. When we're grieving, we can become vulnerable to doubts and wrong thinking. The organization provides exactly the guidance you need. Isolating yourself and relying on independent research will only lead you further from the truth." His response confirmed everything I had learned about the organization's approach to dissent. Questions weren't addressed with evidence. They were dismissed as symptoms of spiritual weakness, requiring organizational correction. "I understand your concern," I replied, "but I need to be honest. I've discovered information about the organization's financial practices and handling of abuse cases that I can't reconcile with our teachings about being God's clean organization. "Oh, Brother Harrison," Brother Stevens said, his voice now carrying unmistakable firmness, "if you've been researching critical information from outside sources, you're already on a dangerous path. That material comes from apostates motivated by Satan to destroy faith. Stop this research immediately and focus on what Jehovah provides through his organization." Those words crystallized the choice I was facing. I could submit to organizational authority by abandoning my questions, or I could pursue truth wherever it led, knowing that honest inquiry was characterized as spiritual rebellion. That evening, instead of attending the elders' meeting, I wrote a letter to the body of elders. After 30 years of faithful service, I can no longer in good conscience participate in this organization. This decision comes from careful examination of information that contradicts fundamental claims about the organization's role as God's sole channel of communication. I have discovered financial practices inconsistent with the modest lifestyle demanded of members, institutional responses to abuse allegations that prioritize organizational reputation over victim welfare, and historical patterns suggesting human fallibility rather than divine guidance. I will not be returning to meetings. This decision is final and based on conscientious conviction. Respectfully, Michael Harrison. Writing those words felt like stepping off a cliff, but also like breathing freely for the first time in months. The next morning, I drove to the Kingdom Hall and slid the envelope through the mail slot. Brother Stevens called within hours. "Michael, you can't make this decision while you're clearly not thinking straight. We're arranging for the circuit overseer to meet with you. He can provide the spiritual assistance you need to overcome these doubts." "My decision is final," I replied, surprised by my own calmness. "I've spent months carefully considering this choice. It's based on evidence and conviction, not emotional instability." "Then you're choosing to abandon Jehovah and his people," he said, his voice carrying disappointment and finality. "You know what this means for your relationship with grace and everyone who loves you. Are you really willing to throw away eternal life for these doubts that Satan has planted in your mind?" His words struck at what made leaving so difficult, not the loss of religious beliefs, but the loss of human relationships that had defined my social world for 30 years. "I'm not abandoning God," I replied, my voice breaking slightly. "I'm abandoning a human institution that has convinced its members it speaks for God. There's a difference, even if you can't see it right now." Brother Stevens ended the call without saying goodbye. Within a week, the announcement was made. Michael Harrison is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. 28 words that erased 30 years of service and marked me as spiritually dead to everyone who had been part of my religious family. The finality felt both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it confirmed the loss of every meaningful relationship I had maintained for 3 decades. Liberating because it freed me from pretending to believe in something that no longer made sense. My disfellowshipping announcement brought a silence I had never experienced in 30 years of adult life. No phone calls from concerned brothers checking on my spiritual welfare. No visits from sisters offering meals or encouragement. No invitations to congregation gatherings or family-style dinners that had punctuated our social calendar for decades. The absence of contact was so complete, it felt like I had died and was observing my own funeral from a distance. Grace's response was the most painful aspect of this systematic erasure. 2 days after the announcement, she called from her apartment. Across town, her voice trembling with what I recognized as carefully controlled emotion. "Dad," she said, the word carrying both intimacy and finality, "I heard about the announcement at the meeting. I need you to know that I love you, but I can't continue our relationship while you're disfellowshipped. The organization's guidance is clear about not associating with former members, even family members, because it could weaken my own faith. Her words followed the script I had heard recited in countless Watchtower articles about maintaining loyalty to Jehovah despite family members who had left the truth. But hearing them directed at me, spoken by the daughter I had raised and loved for 27 years, felt like physical violence disguised as spiritual principle. "Grace," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "nothing has changed about my love for you or my desire to be part of your life. I've simply reached different conclusions about religious truth than the ones we were taught. That doesn't make me dangerous or unworthy of your affection." "But it does, Dad," she replied, and I could hear tears in her voice even as she maintained doctrinal firmness. "The organization teaches that apostates are among the most dangerous people because they use emotional appeals to draw faithful ones away from the truth. I can't risk my spiritual standing by maintaining close contact with you, no matter how much I might want to personally." The conversation lasted only a few more minutes, but it confirmed the completeness of my expulsion from the only social world I had known since my early 20s. Grace's adherence to organizational policy meant losing not just religious community, but the most important personal relationship remaining in my life after Linda's death. Within a month, the practical consequences of shunning became apparent, in ways I hadn't anticipated. My barber, a long-time witness who had cut my hair for 15 years, refused to acknowledge me when I entered his shop. The mechanic who had serviced our cars for a decade suddenly claimed he was too busy to schedule appointments. Even casual acquaintances from the workplace began treating me with obvious discomfort after news of my disfellowshipping spread through local witness networks. The psychological impact of this comprehensive social rejection was more devastating than I had prepared for, despite knowing intellectually what shunning involved. During my years as an elder, I had participated in implementing this policy toward others, believing it was a loving arrangement designed to encourage repentance and return to spiritual safety. Experiencing it from the receiving end revealed its true function, social control, through fear of abandonment. Yet alongside the grief and isolation came an unexpected sense of liberation that grew stronger as weeks passed. For the first time in 3 decades, I could make decisions without filtering them through organizational guidelines. I could read books that had been discouraged or forbidden. I could form friendships based on personal affinity rather than shared religious belief. I could express opinions without worrying about their conformity to official teaching. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. After 30 years of having every significant choice guided by Watchtower publications and elder consultation, the responsibility of autonomous decision-making felt overwhelming. Simple choices like what to do on Thursday evenings or Saturday mornings, times that had been occupied by meetings and field service for most of my adult life, required conscious thought about personal preferences I had suppressed for decades. Began attending a community college philosophy class, something I had always wanted to explore but had avoided because the organization discouraged higher education as a distraction from spiritual priorities. The professor, Dr. Sarah Mills, was a woman about Grace's age who encouraged critical thinking and open discussion of ideas in ways that felt revolutionary after years of accepting predetermined conclusions about every topic. Philosophy, she explained during our first class session, isn't about finding the right answers to predetermined questions. It's about learning to ask better questions and developing skills to evaluate evidence and reasoning critically. The goal isn't certainty, but intellectual honesty and ongoing growth in understanding. Her approach to learning stood in stark contrast to the Watchtower's emphasis on accepting revealed truth from authorized sources without independent verification. In philosophy class, disagreement was encouraged as a path to deeper understanding, rather than condemned as dangerous thinking requiring correction. Through class discussions and assigned readings, I began to understand how thoroughly my capacity for independent thought had been compromised by organizational training. The witness emphasis on submission to authority, suspicion of secular education, and characterization of doubt as spiritual weakness had created mental habits that were difficult to break even after consciously rejecting organizational control. During this period, I also began exploring the broader community of former Jehovah's Witnesses through online forums and local support groups. Meeting others who had experienced similar journeys of awakening and shunning provided validation that my struggles were normal responses to leaving a high-control religious environment rather than evidence of personal failure or spiritual weakness. David Morrison, the former elder I had met at the coffee shop, introduced me to a monthly gathering of ex-witnesses who met to share experiences and provide mutual support. The group included people of all ages who had left the organization for various reasons: doctrinal disagreements, abuse cover-ups, family dysfunction, or simple loss of faith in organizational claims. The hardest part, explained Maria Santos, a woman in her 70s who had left after 40 years of membership, isn't losing belief in specific teachings. It's rebuilding your entire identity when everything you thought you knew about yourself was defined by organizational affiliation. Her words resonated with struggles I was experiencing but hadn't been able to articulate clearly. Another group member, James Wright, had been disfellowshipped for questioning the organization's handling of child abuse cases in his congregation. I tried to work within the system, he explained, reporting concerns to elders, writing letters to the branch office, following all the proper channels. But I learned that the organization's primary concern is protecting its reputation rather than protecting children. When I couldn't stay silent about that reality, I was labeled an apostate and expelled. These conversations helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique or evidence of personal failure, but part of a pattern affecting thousands of former members who had prioritized conscience over conformity. The realization was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it validated my own struggles, disturbing because it revealed the human cost of organizational policies I had once defended as expressions of divine love. As spring turned into summer, I established new routines that reflected my emerging identity rather than organizational requirements. Saturday mornings were spent reading books about history, science, and philosophy instead of participating in field service. Thursday evenings involved volunteering at a local literacy center rather than attending Kingdom Hall meetings. Sunday mornings were reserved for hiking in nearby state parks, connecting with nature in ways that felt more authentically spiritual than sitting through watchtower studies. The volunteer work at the Literacy Center proved particularly meaningful. Helping adults learn to read provided tangible benefits I could see immediately, unlike the theoretical spiritual benefits promised by field service that depended on unprovable claims about future rewards. My students were grateful for practical assistance with skills that improved their daily lives, rather than suspicious recipients of religious literature they hadn't requested. "Mr. Harrison," said one of my students, a woman named Rosa who was learning English after immigrating from Mexico, "thank you for helping me understand these words. Now I can read my daughter's school papers and help her with homework." Her appreciation felt more genuinely meaningful than any field service report I had ever submitted during my decades as a witness. Yet even as I built new routines and relationships, the absence of grace from my life remained a constant source of sadness. I would see young women her age at the grocery store or coffee shops and feel a pang of loss for the daughter who had been trained to view her father's intellectual honesty as spiritual betrayal worthy of complete rejection. Occasionally, I would drive past her apartment complex, hoping for a glimpse of her daily life, but never stopping because I understood that any attempt at contact would likely strengthen her resolve to maintain. Had convinced her that my love was dangerous, that my presence would weaken her faith, and that shunning me was an act of loyalty to God rather than abandonment of family responsibility. The first anniversary of my disfellowshipping arrived in February 2022 with a mixture of reflection and cautious optimism about the future. I had survived a year of complete social rejection, built new relationships based on mutual respect rather than shared doctrine, and discovered capabilities and interests that had been suppressed during my decades of organizational compliance. Most importantly, I had maintained my conviction that choosing truth over belonging was the right decision, despite the ongoing cost in human relationships. The intellectual honesty that had led me away from organizational faith was worth preserving, even when it meant losing everything I had previously considered essential to meaningful existence. 3 years have passed since I walked away from everything I thought defined me, and I'm sitting in the same kitchen where this story began. But the man drinking coffee here now barely resembles the faithful elder who once measured his worth by meeting attendance and field service reports. The morning light filters through windows that Linda would have decorated differently, illuminating a life that has been rebuilt from the foundation up. The silence that once felt devastating has become a peaceful backdrop to days filled with genuine purpose rather than organizational obligation. My small apartment, chosen for affordability rather than proximity to Kingdom Hall, has become a sanctuary where I can think freely without worrying about whether my thoughts conform to approved patterns. The walls are lined with books I was once taught to view with suspicion: philosophy, science, history, literature that explores human experience without filtering everything through religious doctrine. My routine now revolves around choices rather than requirements. Tuesday evenings find me at the Literacy Center, working with students whose gratitude is immediate and tangible. Thursday nights are spent in philosophy class discussions that challenge my thinking rather than reinforcing predetermined conclusions. Saturday mornings are dedicated to hiking trails where I experience something closer to authentic spirituality than I ever found in Kingdom Hall meetings. The volunteer work has expanded beyond literacy tutoring to include helping other former witnesses navigate their transition to life outside high-control religious environments. Through the support group David Morrison introduced me to, I've learned that my experience of awakening and shunning follows patterns familiar to thousands of people who have chosen conscience over conformity. "Michael," said Jennifer Clark, a woman in her 50s who left after discovering the organization's systematic cover-up of abuse in her congregation, "your background as an elder helps people understand that questioning the organization doesn't come from rebellion or moral failure. It comes from integrity and compassion that the system couldn't accommodate." These conversations have revealed how thoroughly the organization's characterization of former members as bitter apostates driven by Satan distorts reality. Most people I've met who left the witnesses are thoughtful individuals who simply couldn't reconcile organizational claims with observable evidence about institutional behavior. Their stories involve careful research, painful soul-searching, and costly decisions to prioritize truth over belonging. Working with newly departed members has also helped me process my own grief about losing grace. Watching other parents navigate the heartbreak of children who choose organizational loyalty over family relationships has shown me that this loss, while devastating, doesn't reflect personal failure, but institutional manipulation that exploits natural human need for belonging and acceptance. Still, hardly a day passes without some reminder of what my honesty cost me. I'll see a father and daughter shopping together, sharing casual conversation that I'm denied with grace. I'll hear about family celebrations I'll never again be invited to attend. I'll drive past the Kingdom Hall, where Linda and I worshipped for 20 years, where Grace still sits in meetings that reinforce her conviction that shunning me demonstrates faithfulness to God. The anniversary of Linda's death brings complicated emotions each year. Grief for her absence mingles with gratitude that she spared the pain of watching our family fracture along organizational lines. Sometimes I imagine conversations we might have had about my discoveries, wondering whether she would have found the courage to question everything we built our life around, or whether her deeper immersion in organizational culture would have made her another casualty of institutional loyalty. Her personal notebook, with its private reflections about doubt and suffering, remains one of my most treasured possessions. Reading her hidden questions reminds me that integrity sometimes requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths, even when voicing them comes at terrible personal cost. Linda's private struggles with faith validate my own journey toward intellectual honesty, even though she never lived to complete that journey herself. The financial pressures that once seemed overwhelming have proven manageable through simpler living and different priorities. Without contributions to the worldwide work, assembly expenses, and constant pressure to purchase organizational literature, my modest pension provides adequate resources for comfortable retirement. The freedom from guilt about financial stewardship has been as liberating as freedom from doctrinal compliance. My relationship with my workplace colleagues has improved significantly since leaving organizational restrictions on social interaction. Former associates who once kept careful distance because of my religious affiliations now include me in conversations and social gatherings that were previously off-limits. The boundaries that seemed like spiritual protection now appear to have been walls that prevented genuine human connection. Dr. Mills, my philosophy professor, invited me to audit additional courses after completing her introductory class with enthusiasm she found noteworthy. "Michael," she said during office hours one afternoon, "your questions reflect someone who's genuinely hungry for understanding rather than simply seeking confirmation of existing beliefs. That's relatively rare among students, especially those your age." Her encouragement to continue learning has opened possibilities I never considered during my years of organizational service. Reading Socrates, Descartes, and Hume has provided tools for evaluating truth claims that were systematically discouraged during my witness training. Philosophy has taught me to embrace uncertainty as honest rather than fear it as spiritual weakness. The monthly support group meetings have evolved into genuine friendships with people who understand the unique challenges of rebuilding identity after leaving high-control religious environments. We celebrate each other's milestones. First birthdays celebrated after decades of prohibition, first Christmas decorations displayed without guilt, first blood transfusions accepted without fear of eternal consequences. These celebrations might seem trivial to people who never surrendered basic human freedoms to religious authority, but they represent profound victories for individuals who spent years submitting every personal choice to organizational approval. The joy of making autonomous decisions, even about small matters, continues to feel revolutionary years after gaining that freedom. Sometimes former congregation members approach me in public places, usually when they're alone and unlikely to be observed by other witnesses. These encounters are carefully choreographed, brief acknowledgements, hurried conversations, expressions of concern masked as casual inquiries about my welfare. Invariably, they express puzzlement about my apparent contentment despite losing everything they've been taught to consider essential for meaningful existence. "Michael," whispered Brother Martinez during a chance encounter at the grocery store, "you look, well, happy even. I don't understand how that's possible when you've cut yourself off from Jehovah's organization." His confusion reflected decades of conditioning that equates organizational membership with divine approval and personal fulfillment. These interactions reinforce my conviction that the organization's power depends on members' fear of life outside its control. The reality of former members who thrive after leaving contradicts fundamental claims about the necessity of organizational mediation between individuals and God. My visible happiness threatens the narrative that departure from the group leads, inevitably, to spiritual and emotional destruction. As I write this conclusion, Grace is now 30 years old, married to another devoted witness and expecting her first child, my first grandchild, whom I'll never meet unless she chooses conscience. Over compliance as I eventually did, the pain of this reality has dulled from acute grief to chronic sadness, manageable but permanent. Yet I've learned that choosing truth over belonging, authenticity over acceptance, conscience over conformity was the most important decision I've ever made. The relationships I've lost were conditional on intellectual submission and behavioral compliance. The relationships I've gained are based on mutual respect for individual conscience and shared appreciation for honesty. Turned out to be freedom from kingdoms altogether, freedom from human institutions claiming divine authority over individual conscience, freedom from leaders demanding unquestioning obedience in exchange for promised future rewards, freedom from systems that exploit natural human needs for belonging and security to maintain organizational control. This is a real story shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We'll be very happy to tell your story on our channel.